Once upon a time, there was a little girl. She loved her family. She loved drawing. But more than those things, she loved jumping on the trampoline. Her family had got a trampoline for her when she was only 6 years old. And ever since then, every day, rain or shine, sun or snow, wind or calm, school or weekend, she would have jumped on her trampoline in some capacity. Maybe only for a few minutes, maybe for an hour, maybe for more. She was now 10 years old. She could do forward flips, back flips, she could roll, she could do all sorts of gymnastics maneuvers, the kind that if I were to do so, I would snap my spine, crack my skull, break my arms and legs, and probably end up in some sort of vegetative state. One night, she was on the internet searching for cool trampoline tricks, and she stumbled upon this website. It's really strange. It didn't look like most websites. It had this big picture of the moon in the background, and on the moon there were a bunch of children jumping around. And she thought, well, that makes sense because on the moon you can jump higher because its gravity is less. The way it was written was almost like somebody wrote it who didn't even truly know how to speak English. Whether that's true or not, you will have to be the judge. However, she was looking on this page and she saw all sorts of tricks, the regular tricks, back flip, forward flip, double flip, the Barbosian, Galantro, triple, quadruple, Nigalangadoon dismount. A very crazy move that seldom have any attempted. But she found one move buried at the bottom of this webpage called the Ultimate Moon Bounce. And she reasoned, well, the Ultimate Moon Bounce, if I could go to school and tell my friends I learned the Ultimate Moon Bounce, they would have to think I was cool. And so do you know what she did? She printed out the directions for the Ultimate Moon Bounce. And that night, as she laid in bed listening to her nighttime piano music that helped her relax, she read it. And so what you were supposed to do with the Ultimate Moon Bounce didn't necessarily make a lot of sense to her because it wasn't so much about bouncing. Yes, it said you have to bounce. Use your knees and your hips and rock it up and then fall gently and use your momentum to keep rocketing you. But that's something any trampoline move needed you to do. But this one said, as you're jumping, you need to chant in a deep voice, to the moon I come, to the moon I come, to the moon I come. And the webpage said that if you did that while imagining yourself rocketing into the sky like a spaceship, you would go higher than you had ever done before. So she memorized the instructions and she laid it down on her bed and she forgot about it. She went to bed, went through her whole next day at school, had a lot of fun. She told her friends she was learning a new trampoline trick, but of course, she didn't tell them what it was because she wanted to surprise them. That night, when she got home, she practiced. She got on the trampoline. She did some normal jumps and flips, and then she started, to the moon I come, to the moon I come. She was imagining herself, to the moon I come. She was imagining rockets blasting fire out of her feet and propelling her higher up. And she noticed something. Surprisingly, she went higher than she ever had before, and she knew so because there was a tree that had branches far above where she could reach. And she managed to get up high enough to grab a leaf off the top of this tree. And she went, whoa, this really works. So do you know what she did? She kept jumping, but that night she couldn't get any higher. And as you know, if you think and work at something too long, sometimes you need a mental break. So she went inside, went to sleep, took a mental break. The next day, she repeated the same process. Only today at school, she had a hot dog for lunch, and it wasn't enough, so she went back up to get seconds, and she found out it was a moldy sausage, and so her stomach wasn't feeling that great. So that night, her jump session, she still got high enough to get up to the tree, but she didn't really get any higher. And she wondered if that was just as high as she could get or if it had to do with the moldy sausage. That night, she had a dream. It was a strange dream. She dreamed that she jumped, and she actually jumped so high, she flew into space and then got caught up in the gravity of the moon and got pulled down onto the moon. But the strange thing was, when she got to that moon, she wasn't alone. She didn't remember who or what, perhaps, was there, but she knew she wasn't alone. Now, oddly, when she woke up the next morning, to some kids, that might be a scary dream, jumping off of your planet, being in space with no air to breathe, with something living on the moon. But she found it enlivening, exhilarating, and it gave her motivation that night to try her hardest. So, once again, She went through her day. They played dodgeball in class today. She got hit in the face, did not like it. Her nose was bloody, but it was okay. She went home, thankful to be with her trampoline. She didn't get to jump as early in the day this day because she had lots of homework. So when she went outside, it was also on the brink of dusk. The sun was going down, the first few crickets were out, the clouds were glowing pink on the underneath with what promised to be an amazing sunset. She started jumping. On her very first jump, she got high enough to grab the tree the way she had before. She said, I'm doing it this time. So she sunk into a Zen meditative state, jumped down, to the moon I come! And this time she flew twice as high as she ever had. She went up so high, she could see the roofs of her neighbor's houses. One of them even had missing shingles. She landed, to the moon I come! And this time she jumped. She went up so high that she was higher than a flock of geese flying through the sky. She landed, to the moon I come! And this time, something unprecedented happened. She felt the trampoline push her up with a force that she could not have imagined. And she rocketed up, and the force kept pushing her somehow, and up. She went through a cloud. She went through another cloud. She got hit on the head with a small piece of hail. And then she was above the cloud, a place she had only seen when she was riding on a passenger jet airplane. And up she went, still higher, until she went into outer space. She wanted to scream, but there was no air. She started panicking, her heart started pounding, but she was able to find peace. And for a moment, she looked around, saw the earth below her, the stars in front of her, and she saw the moon approaching. And halfway to the moon, she felt her orientation of gravity switch, and her legs started getting pulled down gently to the moon. And it got to the point where she couldn't hold her breath any longer, and she took a breath. Surprisingly, she could breathe. This was strange. There was no oxygen in outer space. There was only vacuum. The moon did not have an atmosphere. But somehow, she could breathe. She started laughing. She started cheering. And she said to herself, for she knew this had to be a dream, "This is the best dream ever!" And she slowly landed on the moon. Now, something quite shocking happened. She had known that many people from the United States had traveled to the moon before. And she expected perhaps she would see the American flag or some trails from a moon buggy or a moon rover. She saw footprints, and they were going every which direction. But these didn't look like the footprints she imagined an astronaut wearing. They looked like shoes, kids' shoes. They had different patterns, circles, jagged lines, any pattern you would imagine from the bottom of a shoe. And she saw them all walking off in a particular direction. So she started walking off to where those shoes were, and she began to realize something amazing. Each step of hers felt like she was jumping back on Earth. She bounded into the air and flew between steps, and before long, she was doing a kind of loping that had her rocketing across the moon at a speed that she guessed must be something like 20 or 30 miles an hour. It was fun. Finally, she stopped, and she squatted down on her haunches and jumped as high as she could, did a triple backflip, and landed gently on the moon. "This is amazing," she said. Well, she began to get curious. She could see the footprints still going off in the same direction. And as she paid more attention, she realized there must be 100, maybe 200 pairs of feet. So she kept walking. And finally, as she crested a hill up ahead, she saw a mound. It wasn't quite a mountain, it wasn't quite a foothill, but it was a mound of rock. And in that mound of rock was an opening that looked to be a cave. So she walked forward and looked inside. She could hear voices inside. It sounded like the distant noise of laughter reverberating off of rock walls and coming gently out towards her. These were children laughing, boys and girls. And then she could hear talking, and it all sounded merry. So into the cave she went, and for a while she walked in pure darkness, but she kept her hands out to the sides and walked towards the sound. And eventually, her eyes started adjusting to the dark, and she started to see flickering light, which she reasoned must be fire, which again seemed quite strange, for how could fire burn without oxygen? And yet forward she went, till she went around a corner. The cave opened up into a broad cavern. Lining the cavern all along the edge were torches that were flickering happy. And in the middle were all sorts of children. They were jumping and dancing and bouncing. They seemed to be listening to some sort of music that sounded like it had harmonica, guitar, and a soothing violin in the background. They all turned around and they saw her, and they said, "A new girl! A new girl! Who are you?" She introduced herself. As she did so, she shook hands with all the children. There were so many, she couldn't remember their names, but she knew that they were very nice, wonderful children. And so they invited her in. They told her they were just dancing and having playtime. And so she danced with them, doing backflips, showing them all her tricks. There were several gymnasts amongst these kids who were doing tricks that she couldn't do yet, and they started trying to teach her. Well, after about 1 hour of playing, a gong went off, and all the children immediately sat down and got into a praying position. And one of them said, get down, you don't want to mess with these people, get down." So she got down, and into the cavern walked several people in black cloaks. She couldn't even see what their faces were. They shambled in slowly, elegantly, gracefully, until finally they stood in front of all the children, and the one in the middle stepped in the front and raised her hands and said, "All kneel." So the children got down on their knees and looked up at her. And the person, she thought it was a woman because the person in the black cloak had a very feminine voice, said, "Welcome, children. Now, tonight, we must prepare for the grand feast." And all the children said, "Yes, mistress." Well, the girl who we're following, her name is Sandra. She didn't know what the great feast was, so she just sat there and listened. And the person in the cloak, who later introduced herself as Gangla said, "Come with us, follow us into the lower chamber." So all the children rose. Sandra tried to speak, but one of the girls said, "Shh, we must not speak in the presence of the mistress." This made Sandra feel quite uncomfortable, for she reasoned that such a happy, cheerful place should not be one of silence. She followed quietly the mistress Gangla and her compatriots down into the cave, and they emerged into another chamber. This one too was lined with torches, but these torches had a darker aspect to them. The light was redder. It almost seemed a bit sinister. There were stone tables lined about the room, and these stone tables all seemed to have some kind of stains on them. It looked like somebody had spilled jelly or beet juice or something red all over them. And so the mistress advised them all to 4 girls to a table and to scrub and clean them. They were all given red cloths and soap, and they scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. When they were done, which felt like 20 minutes, the robed mistresses went around to the tables and gave each girl a knife that seemed to be made out of a black stone like obsidian, and they instructed them to set the stones down and then make their way to their beds for the night. And Sandra thought it was quite strange. She said, "Well, when are we going to eat?" And the mistress said, "Silence. Tomorrow is the great feast. Tonight you will fast." For those of you who don't know, fasting just means to not eat for a period of time. So Sandra followed all of the girls to another chamber which had many beds. These were not comfortable beds. They were slabs of stone, and they were given a pillow that amounted to not much more than a folded up shirt. It was very uncomfortable. She tried to talk to some of the other girls, but they told her, do not speak. It is sleeping time. The mistresses will punish us." And so to sleep she went. Her dreams this night were not so good. She dreamed of giant teeth chewing on some sort of meat, and little splashes of blood popping out as they talked while they chewed. It seemed very ominous to her. She did not like it, and so she woke up in the middle of the night. As she woke up, she heard the sounds of girls snoring, the occasional sneeze. She heard the occasional sound of a boomers, which is another name for a fart. All normal sounds you would expect when there was 100 or more children sleeping in a giant room. But then she heard something she didn't expect. "Sandra," she heard. What? What was this sound? "Sandra!" It sounded like her father, Jeff. She got out of her bed and she tiptoed quietly which was actually quite easy with the low gravity. "Sandra!" She tiptoed toward the voice that she heard calling towards her. And as she got close, she heard the voice of Gongra, the mistress, saying, "Who are you?" Then she heard her father, for it was definitely her father, Jeff, saying, "Where's my daughter? How did we get here? What is going on?" And she could hear the mistress, Gongra, saying, "Follow us, we will explain everything." She could hear him asking questions, but they wouldn't answer. And she crept quietly towards them, keeping to the shadows as best she could, until she heard her father scream, "Hey!" And then she heard a thunk, and then she heard the sound of iron bars slamming closed. She heard her father yelling, "Let me out! Let me out of here! Who are you? Where's my daughter?" But the mistresses didn't respond, and there was only silence. She waited in time for the mistresses to disappear and her father's raging to subside. And she proceeded towards him, the sounds of him going, "What am I doing?" and the sounds of crying, "Where am I? What's happened?" Eventually, Sandra came to a small room that could only be described as a jail. There were iron bars covering smaller caves in the rock. She crept up to him. Father, what are you doing here?" "Sandra, you're safe. Where are we?" And she said, "I don't know. I got this guide on how to jump to the moon off a website, and I followed the guide and I jumped to the moon, and somehow I can breathe here, and there's hundreds of girls here, and there's these strange robed women called the mistresses that seem to have us a prisoner, and they're taking us to some sort of great feast tomorrow." And her father said, "I don't like this, Sandra. We need to get out of here." Her father looked around. There was nobody else in the jail cells. And he said, "I saw the mistress. One of the mistresses has a key." Sandra said, "Oh, I must get it. Father, did you see which way they went?" And he said, "Out that way." And he pointed to a little side passage. And so Sandra said, "I'll be right back." And so she crept down the passage. It was narrower and cleaner and was lit with fewer torches than the other passages. It was long. She walked down it, tiptoeing as quietly as she could for what must have been 15, perhaps even 20 minutes, until finally she emerged into another cavern. And this cavern had little doors, wooden doors all around it. And she reasoned these must be the sleeping chambers for each of the mistresses. So she crept up to one of the doors, put her ear to it, and all she heard inside was the sound of snoring. She opened the door gently, wincing as it squeaked just a bit. She made it inside, and thankfully the squeaking had not woken up one of the mistresses. She crept around the room, opened a door, did not see a key. Shucks, she didn't know which mistress had the key. So she went around and slowly did this for each of the rooms, finding nothing. Finally, she went to the last room, opened the door. No creak, which she felt very thankful for. She tiptoed, more silent than a mouse, and found a drawer. And inside that drawer was a key that again looked like it was made out of a stone, like obsidian from Earth. She grabbed the key out, and as she was walking away, she tripped on something, stumbled into the wall, and went, "Ugh!" as she hit her head. She was fine, but the sound had woken up the mistress, who looked at her and said, "What are you doing here? Get back here!" And the mistress started chasing her. Fortunately, Sandra was young and agile, and so she ran as fast as she could, getting distance in front of the mistress, and made it back to her father's chamber just in time to unlock it. They both ran from the chamber as fast as they could. "Which way is out?" her father said. "I don't know," she said. "This way, I think." And so they ran down a hallway until they arrived back into the large chamber with all the tables. And what they saw there horrified them. There were arms and legs that were all chopped up. Oh no, she knew what this meant. They were eating people. They were gonna eat the little girls. She screamed. Her father gasped because his stomach was ill from the horrific sight he saw, and they ran as fast as they could, back up the stairs, back up through a hallway until they got to the initial chamber where they had all played. "That way," Sandra pointed. She and her father ran towards the cave that they believed and went outside. They got out before the mistresses had caught up to them. Now they knew they couldn't escape on the flat moon, so they climbed up above the mound and buried themselves as best they could in the dirt, hoping it would act as camouflage. And it worked, for the mistresses came out, looked around, and said, "Oh, they got away. Well, never mind, we have plenty to eat." And one of the other mistresses laughed and said, "Ha, yes, we do." Sandra didn't like that sound. It sounded like the sound of a witch. Why would there be a witch on the moon? Her father said, let's get out of here. How do we get back to Earth? And Sandra said, I don't know, but we can't leave all those little girls and boys, all those children. And her father said, you're right. So they waited until it had been several hours. And they crept back in. And what they found was one of the witches. She was starting to think of them as witches now instead of mistresses, was standing guard over the chamber that housed all the children. So she and her father reasoned they didn't have time. They rushed her as fast as they could, Sandra from the front, her father from the back. The witch started lunging at Sandra, and while she was lunging at Sandra, her father cracked her in the back of the head with a rock, and she went and fell unconscious. Fortunately, she was still alive. This gave them time to run in and tell all the children to follow them. They told them what was happening, they were going to be eaten, and they told all the children that they thought these women were witches. And the children started thinking and said, oh my God, that makes sense. How are we on the moon? What's happening? It must be magic. And they all ran as fast as they could out of the mound and across the moon. They followed their footprints back to the area where they had all started, where they had all appeared. And they all started jumping. Back to the moon we go. Back to the Earth we go. They tried saying anything they could think as some sort of magic spell to take them back to the Earth. But they couldn't. Nothing was working. And then, slowly, the mistresses, or the witches, walked towards them with their cloaks down. There could be no doubt about whether or not they were witches, for they had green skin, black, rotting teeth, and hair that was falling out. And they started going, oh, you thought you were actually on the moon and could jump back to the Earth? Welcome to our private little witch's world. And one of the others said, you will never escape, so you might as well come back home. Well, the children had none of this. And so Sandra and her father yelled out, attack! There's only 6 of them! And the witches pulled out magic wands. And as the children rushed at the women, trying to tackle them, the witches started casting spells. And when the spells would hit a little girl, they would fall to the ground frozen. It was some sort of paralyzation spell. Well, fortunately for these children, there were enough that they managed to eventually overcome the witches, hold their arms down, and take their magic wands from them. Now, Sandra had heard the witch say the magical spell, Kabuntra! And on the witch they had tackled, she pointed the wand at the witch and said, Kabuntra! And a purple beam shot out and paralyzed the witch. And she went around and did this to all the witches. They all the children and her father sat down and they said, all right, that witch said we weren't on the moon. This was their own private world. This must be some sort of spell. All we have to do is find the magic word to get us out of here. And so they passed the 6 wands to different girls, and they all took their turns trying magical spells. Every once in a while, one of them would make a fart sound or shoot out a lightning bolt or something along those lines. But none of them took them back to Earth. They took turns. They would pass the wands from one girl to the other, saying everything they could think of. And so Sandra was thinking, these were witches. And their website had been about flying to the moon. And she just remembered a spell that she had heard from a movie. And the words moon reversiosa popped into her head. She grabbed a wand and said, moon reversiosa. And then she started floating. And then the other girls started saying, moon reversiosa. And they all cast it. And they all, as a group, started rising up into the air once more. And they started rotating. And they went down, back towards the Earth, and landed gently in the middle of a field at a park called Twin Silo. They all cheered. 2 reasons. They were home. But the other reason was those vile, evil witches were now trapped on the moon or their witch dimension or whatever it was. And so her father said, how do we stop this from ever happening again? And Sandra said, I've got an idea. She snapped her magic wand in half. And the other children, the little girls, the little boys started following. Snap, 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 snap. And then they took the magic wands and they buried each of the little pieces in a different location so that it would be impossible for someone to find these and put them back together. They all said goodbye, and Sandra and her father went home, and her mother asked where they had been, and they tried to tell her, but her mother thought it was a joke and just assumed they were out getting ice cream or something. So she and her father stayed up late that night, and they snuggled up and went to sleep and fell asleep on the couch because they were both just really alarmed. But the next day, they both woke up very thankful for a couple things. They still had each other, they had gotten rid of those evil witches, and they had escaped with their life and had an adventure. But in the back of their mind, they always wondered, were there other witches? Well, I suppose that's something for us to find out another time. I do just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to my story, whoever you are and however you found your way here. To my son Alden, I love you. You are in my heart, always, no matter where you're at. And so I hope you're having an excellent sleep tonight. I love you, and good night.